Hello, and welcome to this virtual dialogue, Defining Statehood, Law, Legitimacy, and Global Power, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. My name is Ricky Bevington. I am president of the World Affairs Council, and we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to amplifying informed thought leadership that prompts new thinking on critical global issues. Throughout the year, we feature diplomats, dignitaries, executives, and subject matter experts like today who provide world-class analysis of geopolitics, foreign policy, trade in the economy, armed conflict, climate change, and many more topics. You can learn more about our work and our impact at our website, which is wacatlanta.org. That's also where you can sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on upcoming programs. So we'd like to recognize today's co-sponsoring organization, the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. Hello and welcome to guests and members joining us from Texas and the Western Coast. This program is on the record. The statements made today are those of the speaker and not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And in terms of how the hour will play out, our panelists will have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes. And at that point, we will turn to live audience questions, so please have them ready. Please be brief and concise and use the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen to enter your question. So we will begin by placing this discussion in context. The definition of statehood remains one of the most contested questions in international law and global politics. And we say it's timely today because the United Nations is preparing for its 80th General Assembly next week in New York City, and that is where nearly 200 member states will come together to discuss the world's problems and hopefully some solutions as well. So, who gets to be a state? In today's complex world where contested territories, partial recognition, and de facto states challenge the international order, what does statehood mean? Here to answer this question are two world-renowned experts in international law and statehood studies. We will start with Diane Marie Amen, is Regents Professor of International Law, and she holds the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Chair in International Law at the University of Georgia Law School. Since she joined the Georgia Law faculty in 2011, she has taught constitutional law, public international law, international human rights, laws of war, NATO, children and international law, refugee and asylum law, criminal law, international criminal law, and transnational criminal law. Needless to say, she knows a lot about this topic. And Professor Amen is joining us from London, where she is serving as a visiting academic at University College of London Faculty of Laws. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here, Ricky.
And Gazim Visoka is joining us from Ireland, where he is Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. Dr. Visoka is a leading international scholar on statehood and state recognition and post-conflict peace building and state building. His research focuses on the making, remaking, and unmaking of states and peace processes in contemporary world politics. Welcome to you.
Thanks for having us, Ricky. Great to be here.
Let's begin with Diane answering what legal frameworks are most often applied to defining statehood, and I'll invite you to also help us provide examples.
I'd love to do that. Thank you so much, Ricky. In fact, the question of what is a state is in part, in no small part, a legal question. And the challenge is that the answer to that has varied over time. In fact, if we think about 1945 at the end of World War II, many people in the world were still ruled by empires, which is a very different way of organizing government and governmental structures. But as a result of the UN Charter being adopted 80 years ago, the idea of single nation states, many of them, today there are nearly 200, really took hold. And with that became the need to better define what those entities are. It had been for many centuries, really, the rule that states were defined, a new state was defined by the old states. So it really was a matter of entering the club. And the club, largely European countries, with a few in North America, beyond that, sometimes decided with some consistency what was a state and what was not. Sometimes it was really more a matter of policy than of rule. In the post-World War II era, there arose something called the Montevideo Qualifications, and that's named after a treaty that was adopted by the United States and several states in Latin America in 1933 in the capital of Uruguay, Montevideo. And there's one sentence in this treaty which is called the Duties and Rights of States. The very first provision in that treaty begins by saying, the state, as a legal person in international law, should possess the following qualifications. A permanent population. B, B, a defined territory. C, government. And D, the capacity to enter into international relations with other states. When I teach this course, I refer to the mnemonic PDGC, which is what we get to as pretty darn good criteria. It's a good way to begin to see what might work as a state. It is not, however, a hard and fast definition. Even the treaty says should possess, does not say must possess. And we can find many examples of things that are considered states that lack some of those things. So for instance, the concept of permanent population assumes a permanently reproducing population. But if I tell you the Holy See, aka the Vatican, is considered a state, it's not supposed to have a reproducing population. That's contrary to the nature of that particular state. And we could get many other examples where states maybe have contested borders, large refugee or diaspora populations. Their government may allege to be corrupt, a narco state or something like that. Over time, we've learned that the absence of one of those four qualifications does not necessarily mean the entity is not a state. Similarly, there are entities that possess all four. Let's think about Taiwan. Taiwan clearly has a defined territory, an island, a population that's reproducing for generations. It's considered an effective government, and indeed, even the United States has been in treaties with it, international agreements. And yet it is not considered a state for other reasons. So I'm going to stop there, and we can continue the conversation in any way that you like.
Thank you for that groundwork, Diane. And Gazim, I'll invite you to ask the other question, was just to provide some examples of unrecognized entities or contested states, and then explain how they also do function on the international stage.
Yeah, so just building on what Diane said, I suppose recognition is a social construct. And throughout history, it has changed meaning, and it has changed the norms upon which it has embedded its justification. Practices have changed. So in one hand, we've seen this trend where states have tried to control who enters the club of independent states. But on the other hand, we've seen also the emergence of new states or other states who have defined these norms and rules, basically the UN-based or UN-centered international system. So as a result of that, we kind of have a two-layered international order, one revolving around recognized states, and the other one around these de facto states, some who might have declared independence and have sort of ascertained their sort of effectiveness or de facto control, might meet the criteria of Montevideo Convention, but lack recognition. So in addition to effectiveness argument, there's also the legitimacy argument, namely how they came about to become an independent state. Was that through use of force or through an illegal process without perhaps consent of the parent state? But that is a different question. But what it's relevant for this discussion is that yes, we have a number of de facto states who exist in the map of the world geographically, but not recognized in the map of sort of formal sort of states, and they are very much challenging entities. They certainly, depending on what degree of recognition they have, they might receive the same treatment as other state, let's say, diplomats or representatives, but often they end up being second-tier sort of entities. They don't get the same treatment or access to international organizations, benefits from membership, or access to aid and other sort of protections. So, for example, Taiwan, whenever they come to Europe, they don't meet with the same level of diplomats, but they are always met by a lower level diplomats. If other sort of Sahrawi diplomats want to attend an event, they have to find ways of accessing that through a sponsor or member state to give them access. Or Kosovo needs to find loopholes in the system, for example, to join organizations where there might not be a veto by Serbia or Russia or other adversaries. So depending on the case, they are very much obliged to find back channel ways to exist, but often they end up being sort of satellites or vassal to another state. For example, Sahrawi diplomats in West Sahara are dependent on Algeria. Kosovo very much on Western partners like US or Albania or others in the region. Now, Abkhazia or South Ossetia, which are breakaway territories of Georgia, they are dependent on Russia. Taiwan, the same with regard to sort of, China. Somaliland, in relation to Somalia, they have to rely on whatever partners they find. And often, so they are obliged to sort of morph into involving diasporas that they have, who have dual citizenship, and that way they can overcome access with visa or access to different events. And they might run unofficial embassies or offices, which often are sort of known by the authorities but not closed, but nonetheless they don't have the same diplomatic access and recognition and credentials.
You say recognition is a social construct, and there's international recognition, but there's also domestic recognition. So how do, just following up on that, how do unrecognized entities, maintain legitimacy among their populations, at home? And also, what is the impact of diaspora populations?
Well, I'll start with that. I think one thing that we need to keep clear is an unrecognized entity may in fact be a state, and that's what Yazim means when he speaks of de facto. It doesn't mean it's not a state. It means that it's not given by the club. The club can't prevent it from being a state, but the club can prevent it from entering the clubhouse in full. And so,
And by the clubhouse, do you mean the United Nations?
not necessarily. There are certainly, the United Nations is an intergovernmental organization that's vast, powerful, has many agencies, but there are others. The International Criminal Court, for instance, is not part of the United Nations. The European Union is not part of the United Nations. And sometimes those entities are permitted admission to those other organizations and operate as a state within those organizations. Indeed, even some of the United Nations organizations like UNESCO have admitted entities, Palestine being the notable one, into their membership of states, even though full UN membership has been blocked for Palestine. So the map gets incredibly complex. And so what does that mean for the domestic population? If you are a state, if you hold yourself out as a state, you have declared, you possess the pretty darn good criteria. Another way to think about it is, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, even if other people say it's a swan. If you have that, your population will expect you to act that way. And so you seek membership in the organizations that will let you in. You try to enter agreements with whoever will enter agreements with you on things like trade, refugee movement, labor rights, all kinds of things. In fact, we see that some of these states that have been able to get into some organizations have joined as many as they could. Similarly, many treaties permit entities that are not UN member states to join. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is one, and many economic treaties include entities like the European Union, the Holy See, etc., that are full members of that treaty, that behave as international actors, even if they are not UN member states. And so if you are a domestic politician, you're going to work to make that happen, both to show to your populace you're doing your best, you're exercising what you see as your sovereignty, and also to persuade and demonstrate through your own behavior to the skeptical countries of the world that you really are ready to become a full member of the club.
Can I just add there that there's a prevailing thesis that sort of one of the reasons why de facto states try to democratize is, as Diane said in the end, to sort of build the argument that they are worthy of recognition, and they meet these what are referred as subjective criteria of statehood, which is protection of minorities, democracy, and being a viable state. Something we didn't cover yet is that whenever the European community sort of was forming its foreign policy at the end of Cold War, they had to make up their mind on how to recognize former Yugoslav states and former Soviet republics. And they came up with a number of guidelines, and that kind of became a normative basis for recognition of new states, which involved very much making sure that new states would be recognized only if they won't become troublesome actors in world politics. And that's where the origins of avoiding failed state or collapsed state recognition emerged. So to go back to Diane's point, sort of partial recognition or non-recognition often serves as democratizing force domestically, because these entities have to behave and prove to the world that they should be recognized. And for these states, recognition becomes a defining feature of their statehood or their existence. It is #1 foreign policy priority, #1 domestic priority, because everything revolves around recognition in terms of trade, travel, personal safety and security, loans, access to financial aid, protection. So certainly the sort of leaders of these states gain domestic legitimacy based on how much recognition they secure or membership in international organizations. So they often employ lobbying companies or diaspora solely to very much enhance their international standing, with the sole goal of them domestically retaining power.
I will just pause here and invite our audience to use the Q&A function if you do have questions for our experts. This is a special opportunity to ask both professors your questions about statehood here for the next about 30 minutes. So please just enter your question into the Q&A function. In the meantime, we'll get to those in just a few minutes. I will continue with my questions. So we've talked about it sounds like the benefits of gaining recognition and status as a state. And we have two, there's the practice or the recognition, and then there's being a state on paper and being recognized by the international community. Can one theory of statehood better accommodate the realities of modern geopolitics? The Montevideo Convention's almost 100 years old. So this is a question for both of you.
Well, I tend to be eclectic in my approach to international law and indeed law in general. And I think that this too is a space where an eclectic approach, an approach that's flexible, that takes the best from everything, is probably a good thing. And I think if we look historically over time, that's exactly what we've seen. We can see almost ebbs and flows in the popularity of one theory or one approach over another. it's important for entities that have met the pretty darn good criteria to be able to operate as such without being beholden to some other powerful group of states. I think that's really important. It's important for the self-determination of the peoples within those states. It's important because otherwise, whatever that powerful grouping is maintains a chokehold really on the global system. And indeed, interestingly enough, the Montevideo qualifications arose not to keep states out. They were an initiative of Latin American states to declare themselves states as soon as they decolonized, even though European states were not yet ready to welcome them fully into the club. And so the idea was, we don't need recognition in order to be a state, to start operating like a state. Recognition became then almost sort of an additional political act by the rest of the world. And so even when we talk about unrecognized states, probably the first question we have to is, how unrecognized? Palestine at the moment is recognized by 147 countries out of about 193 UN members. We have at least half a dozen countries that have said that this month they are going to announce their recognition of Palestine. If they go through with it, that will include 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, nearly all of NATO, quite a lot of the European Union, and most of the rest of the world outside of Europe and the United States. Kosovo, as I know Gazim well knows, has over 100 countries that recognize it. And so that tells us that we need flexibility and adjustment, because this process is going to be fluid and move over time. Perhaps the next time we meet, Kosovo will be a full member of the United Nations, but it will be this process of gaining recognition, of demonstrating its ability to be a responsible member of the world community in whatever the world community feels that means, that will get it to that place.
Yeah, maybe I can add here a number of nuances. So for a while, and I think sort of the question of recognition and statehood cannot be removed from the bigger IR debates and theories. So for a while, the best explanation of the trends of recognition and statehood were very much on the domain of liberalism, where we had some institutional stability, hegemon sort of policing the world, US during the 90s and then early 2000. And that kind of created some sort of, predictability in terms of patterns of who can be a state and when they can be recognized. I think so that liberal, legalistic, institutionalist sort of era has ended. We're entering a perhaps new realist episode in world politics, where we have a multipolar or post-liberal international order, and any consensus that existed in terms of who should be recognized and who should be a state has faded away. Now we are experiencing a very much chaotic, polarized international system, where even the West that sort of held some normative standards when it came to recognition are revising their assumptions. We've had, for example, and this started with recognition of Israel's control of Golan Heights as a breach of Western sort of, upheld of the sort of some of the liberal legalistic threshold, and then later with recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, which very much sort of explained that even the West is entering the Chinese-Russian approach to recognition. Which again is very challenging because it is undermining the normative and moral uphold of Western states. So I suppose the best explanation at the moment is that there is political realism back. It is very hard to go back to the legal normative considerations that Diane and I discussed earlier to explain the patterns of behavior of states. And also, then the trend of sort of Palestine recognition brings back the debate of does recognition make a state, or is it effective control of territory that makes you a state? And it shows that neither of them is fully true. So both explanations carry some merit. In other words, to be a functioning and exist as a state, you need both recognition and de facto or effective control of a territory population and have an effective government. So one without the other cannot exist. So certainly, sort of these big changes are redefining the debates and redefining the field, and there's no single one explanation, I suppose, that could best explain what's happening.
This is really about rule of law, this question, and it just sounds like, you know, we have international law, and then we have how it plays out in real life, which is, I guess, how all of life works. But you know, international law is important for us to have a level playing field. So we're talking about legal principles, but are they being overshadowed by strategic interests as the concepts of statehood evolve?
Well, I think it's notable there is no binding international law defining what is a state. The treaty that we talked about at the beginning only has 5 states parties to it, and they're
Okay.
all in Latin America. That in itself is telling. States throughout history have essentially enforced ambiguity on this question in order that they can let politics be the most important thing if they wish it to be. Even in that era in the 1990s, after the breakup of the Soviet bloc, when we did see the requirement, as Gezim talked about, of anti-corruption standards, good governance standards, democratization. In Europe, abolition of the death penalty was expected as one of the things that had to happen if these new states were going to be fully welcome. Even in that period, that was a political choice. There wasn't any treaty really that was binding that said, you are not a state unless you do these things. It was more if you want to be part of the Council of Europe, be part of what we consider to be a European state, you need to do this. Or in the case of some of the new states that have gone directly to the United Nations that aren't part of Europe, sometimes those have been imposed either directly as part of membership or in conversation with the World Bank, right? Access to that sort of thing. So states, in truth, the club lost perhaps a little bit of control with the declaratory theory. It was possible for an entity to hold itself out of the state, but it maybe just moved back a little bit and was less evident until this moment. And I agree with Gezim on this, where I think we're seeing much more overt statements by powerful states about what they expect of other actors. And where that takes us is open. Will things like democratization matter anymore as a criterion? Or will it be how much of your natural resources are you going to hand over to us? If we think about a lot of the negotiations with Ukraine, the foremost thing that was discussed earlier this year was access to rare earth metals in Ukraine, not whether Ukraine is moving forward on democratization. So we may see the same dynamic, but a different basket of interests by these powerful states being the conditions, if you will, either soft or hard, to full recognition, full acceptance, full participation in the community of states.
Yeah, so I suppose when the debate on sort of Trump and his transactional foreign policy became prevalent recently, I started rethinking sort of the practice of these de facto states when it comes to their foreign policy. And in fact, they have been transactional. So Trumpist foreign policy was before Trump Trump that approach prevalent in these domains. So I think it's important to highlight that from beginning, sort of de facto states or any state that was born out of some sort of secession or without the consent of the parent state, they had to buy that statehood, or they owned to another state. They were very much put in debt. So they became an ally to another state. They had to give part of their resources. They had to give allegiance to that sort of block of states who recognized them first. And as you can see these days, the number one biography of a state is who recognized us first, and and that kind of laments the 101 of friendships in world politics. So recognition always involves transactions, so it's never granted per se on some sort of an objective requirements, even though we would like that to happen, as Diane said, because that would provide stability, predictability, and so on and so forth. But it has always been the weakest part of international law and the strongest part of geopolitics or power politics. And in that sense, what's happening at the moment in the world, it might provide opportunities for some of the de facto states to actually overcome their isolation. Because throughout history, we have seen the opening and the closing of international system. The international system opened for colonial entities during the decolonization process, and we have had over 50 new states being born as part of the decolonization process. And the doors were closed. The club opened the doors for those states, did not consider whether they met the statehood criteria or not. They were accepted on moral grounds. But there was a geopolitical purpose behind this. We know that Soviet Union, from very beginning, the Leninist doctrine of self-determination was born on the grounds of weakening Western, as they called, imperialism. So throughout history, recognition and statehood or secession have always been used by one bloc to weaken their opponents. French and Spanish, supported U.S. independence to weaken the Brits. Americans, U.S. supported Latin American recognition to weaken the Spanish. And the waves go on and on and on. Same as with the Ottoman Empire and the republics in Eastern Europe. Same as with the Habsburg Empire. And what's happening at the moment now is that battlefield for redefining geopolitics or kind of alliances is also happening again around these de facto contested states. Look at Western Sahara, look at Somaliland, look at Ukraine, look at Georgia, Taiwan. All these are the hotspots where great powers redefine their pecking order and their regional dominance. So certainly it is an opening for a lot of these new de facto states to use this opportunity to build new alliances and overcome their isolation. And certainly we might see a birth of a new state, Somaliland, with the help of US as a result of geopolitical changes in the region and a transactionalist sort of attitude in DC. We saw the death of Nagorno-Karabakh or the Republic of Artsakh as a result of geopolitical rivalries. Despite the strong Armenian lobby in US, they were not able to protect this territory that was populated by ethnic Armenians, but de facto legally belonged to Azerbaijan. And now we're seeing a resurfacing of claims for secession in Bosnia with Republika Srpska. North of Kosovo is again disputed. We're seeing Transnistria as a hotspot in Moldova and many small regions in Asia and other parts of the world. So certainly it's a very dynamical field, and power politics will redefine all of these sort of tectonic changes in world politics.
Thank you for the reminder, Gazim, that this is not a 21st century issue or 20th century issue. As the United States prepares to celebrate our 250th anniversary next year, we were once an entity that declared itself as an independent entity, state, country, and we sought international recognition. We, the United States, sought recognition from the UK, from China, and France and others for legitimacy. And for their own strategic geopolitical interests, they said, yes, we will support your then a revolution. So certainly grounded and timely for Americans who are joining us today. Speaking of power politics, the current club is not just the Security Council, but certainly the IMF, the World Bank, others, but really China, Russia, and the US are very big players at the moment. So let's just take a moment for me to ask you, how are these three shaping the global landscape of recognition through their foreign policy today?
Well, I would add the European Union to that as well. It is trying at least to turn that into a quartet. And I think that the sense that what they think they stand for may be under threat has galvanized that group. And I think we see it even with last month's actions surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war. We saw the EU really become united in a certain policy strategy vis-a-vis Ukraine that was not necessarily supported by the United States, at least from what we saw in the news. We also have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which is just completed in Beijing, and we saw both Russia and North Korea coming together quite publicly in at least a show of some kind of alliance. That organization has been around for a while now, but I think it's probably its most robust meeting. And we'll have to see how that plays out. What does that mean? What interests do they think align? Is it simply to look as an opposition to the West? Or do they really have some interest in the sense of becoming their own alliance in the way that the EU or NATO or something does? I think that that remains an open question. And I think we also need to see the extent to which these realigning states in all directions are going to prioritize economy over security or vice versa. And what they're going to do about this basket of issues that in the last, say, 80 years, we're talking about the anniversary of the UN Charter, in the last 80 years has been really important, which is human rights, human security, democratization. Are they going to fully deprioritize that, or where is that going to end up on the scale? I think those are all open questions that we can't get from the performances we're seeing, which tip to us the reality, I think, that there isn't a realignment happening, but they're not really telling us yet what the content of that is.
Yeah, I guess we're in the middle of multiple transitions and power transitions, alliance transitions, and often these happen through these sort of small encounters and events, and it's hard to really sort of see a major turning point for these changes. But one point I would add is that UN-based international system is collapsing, and UN as an organization, as a platform that was meant to assist in resolving these conflicts about territory, about recognition, and others, has failed to achieve that goal, unfortunately, and has been sidelined by great powers and other regional actors as such. And it has become only a symbolic representation body, at least for now, and its agency and power has been significantly sidelined, as well as in practice. Remember, UN peacekeepers are stuck for decades in some of the most protracted secession or self-determination conflicts. Cyprus, Kashmir, Western Sahara, as just three examples, and they represented the beginning of the hope in a UN system that from the local to the global, we will be able to resolve these conflicts and not leave to great powers to decide on territorial conflicts, territorial peace. But unfortunately, over time, that consensus has faded, and we've gone back to great powers deciding on the fate of the global map. And that means that small states, weak actors, will be completely sort of, disregarded, sidelined, and not taken into account when it comes to their sort of, existence as independent entities or their position in the world.
We have about 10 minutes for some audience questions. They're very good, so I will ask our professors to, hopefully we can get through as many of these as possible. Speaking of great powers who will be making decisions, we have a question from Robert Gray, who asks, how much power does India have in international relations, and what role will they play in the bipolar order that is rapidly emerging?
I would put that in the it remains to be seen category. India also was at the meeting that I talked about. It at the moment, it's certainly in natural resources, landmass population has incredible potential. It, as a matter of governance, has been in something of a nationalistic mode rather than an internationalistic mode recently. The appearance at the Shanghai meeting was perhaps a movement away from that, but I don't feel qualified to make any predictions about where that's going at this point.
And to clarify, will Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi attending that meeting is what you're referring to?
Yes.
Gezin, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I suppose just kind of, resembling the historical role of India. I mean, they were one of the leaders of non-aligned movement during the Cold War with Yugoslavia, and they kind of played that sort of balancing role in that bipolar order. So it remains to be seen whether they're gonna play both systems. At the moment, that's what they're doing. They are democracy, but very much aligned with authoritarian regimes. So it is a bit early to see the sort of grand design or grand approach. But one fact is known that as opposed to China, who has the willpower to be a great power, India lacks that collective will to join the pecking order. And that's kind of a certain argument that to be a great power, to be a dominant power, you need to have that objective. And India has not really made up its mind whether they want to become a regional hegemon, if you may, to use the word of realism. And often, I mean, compared to China, they kind of lack that ambition. So it remains to be seen where they position themselves.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Here's a question from Puhiza Shemzadini. I'm going to shorten this. The United Nations often puts standards on de facto states without itself following those standards. What do you think of the double standards that international law holds towards unrecognized states?
Yeah. Maybe Diane, you want to start with this?
You can go first.
Yeah, so I would say there are multiple standards. It's not only double standards. So I presume Puhiza is sort of maybe perhaps alluding to Kosovo or some of the other sort of regions and entities and states where the UN has had administrations. Yeah, so UN can be as good as P5 and member states allow it to be, and certainly on the field, UN has demonstrated multiple standards of conduct, and depending on the leadership of that UN mission, if they were sort of affiliated with Russia or Global South, they would push a certain agenda on the ground, or whether they were with US and European partners, they would push a certain agenda. So often UN reflects on the ground the personalities and sort of, power backers in New York. And that is demonstrated then on the agenda focus they perform. And certainly in some cases, then it appears as they're having double standards or not recognizing sort of the sovereign equality or standing of the recipient state. In other instances, they might appearing as more normative as others. For example, in Palestine, UN is really kind of, going extra mile, demonstrating a moral clarity and normative role. Whereas in other cases, such as Western Sahara, UN is absolutely behind great power dynamics, France, Morocco, and others. So they're very much shadowed by these roles. So it depends from one case to another, but certainly I would agree that there are a lot of double standards on the ground.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. Here's a question from Milton Bevington. What is your view that China's recently announced global governance initiative could attract enough support to become a new house next to the United Nations built to see who else wants to move in?
Well, I think China watchers will be the first to tell you that this is also part of a process and perhaps not a new initiative. I was in meetings 15 years ago with, I can hear in my mind the French ambassador to China, the immediate past French ambassador to China, with his hair on fire about the way that China was going about the world, making transactional deals with countries and saying to countries that say had natural resources, we would love to come in and, you know, help you mine these resources. And unlike the European Union, we aren't going to attach any human rights or anti-corruption, etc. conditions. We are going to make a straight up dollar for dollar, yen for yen deal. And that's been going on for decades now. And so I really see China's moment this week as a more public, or perhaps publicly recognized, perhaps it's more that the Western media paid attention this year, example of that rather than a new initiative. They have been building alliances with states throughout the world in this manner, using financial transactions as the driver, and making themselves look attractive in part because, you know, the EU and the US both conditioned foreign aid on the sorts of democratization initiatives we talked about. And I think part of the realignment we're talking about is that this may be the moment for China to begin to assert itself if it perceives that some in the West are trying to copy that model.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, this is a classic Chinese approach to include all the buzzwords to attract global South and small states and sort of, you know, kind of keep that global consensus or attraction. We know that for a dominant power, for great power to be great power, they can't only exist based on their strength, like military strength, population, economy. They need to be recognized as a great power. So there's another layer of recognition we didn't discuss, which is status recognition. And for me, this is very much an attempt to solidify that status recognition as a global power, as a normative power. We know that China, for over a decade, has tried to penetrate UN system, to take over portfolios that the West has championed, such as peacekeeping, development, and human security, and through that to then solidify, as Diane said, their economic interest in global South mostly.
We have a comment from Craig Meyer who says, I believe Bill Gates at one time was going to set up a new version of a United Nations group. Would either of you like to confirm or elaborate? I don't know. I'm not familiar with this. But it sounds like there have been efforts to work around this if what Craig Meyer is saying is true. We do have a question from Deborah Saki, who really asked about the future. So this is a great opportunity to kind of just look to the future. We've talked about a lot of the past and changes that are going on now. Deborah says, do you see the definition and theories of statehood evolving over time? And if so, in what direction?
Well, that's a perennial question. And I think if we look at the, now I'm going to have to look back to look forward, the so-called end of the Cold War, which some of us are wondering if that ever really happened. But one of the things we saw then was a lot of discussion of a post-national order. This idea that interstate cooperation, international organizations, important actors then like Bill Gates and others were going to start playing such an outsized role on the international scene that states would no longer be the most important actor. There certainly have been entities like that that have been important in the world today. But states, for the most part, have maintained their primary position. The question is, does that change? And some of the things that might change it are the competition over what's left of areas of our universe that are not state bound. And so I think about the deep seabed in the oceans, outer space, and cyberspace are areas that do not recognize defined territories, that do not have permanent populations in the way that we think about with statehood, alliances of peoples, the way that boundaries are organized are radically different. And yet all three are resources for different uses that the world is trying to harness right now. I'd also add Antarctica and the Arctic to that list. And what we're seeing in part is some states are trying to consolidate power to find international law theories or raw politics that say we can claim that. You know, Canada says we get all the way up to the North Pole if you just draw the map that way. But there's pushback against that, both because countries that can't show on the map that they deserve a piece of it are going to resist that, and because these are global goods that need to be harvested and used in responsible ways. And I think there's a deep concern of, if we move away from the state, what is going to be the entity that regulates this so that we don't exploit the deep seabed in a way that is both an environmental disaster and a food security disaster, because all the marine life are taken. Outer space, the interest seems to be as much militarization of space as domestic use of space. That should be a matter of great concern if we as a global society haven't figured out how to regulate that and how to set some rules and boundaries. So that may be a post-national order, a post-state order, but I think there is a need for some real responsible, deep thinking about what the organization of those spaces are going to be for the people that are on the earth.
I would add here the digital domain as well. That is really sort of pushing the boundaries of statehood. We are seeing practices of digital recognition, sort of in addition to be recognized by states or other states, new states or de facto states seek recognition by social media companies, recognition in being part of websites or platforms. So, the digital domain has really expanded the scope of what sort of recognition you need and by whom you need recognition. So that's one domain that is expanding. And the other one is digital statehood, which is an evolving, a new debate revolving around some islands like Tuvalu, who due to climate change might sink underwater and lose territorial existence of Tuvalu. So Tuvalu has reformed their constitution. They've prepared themselves to retain the UN seat and move the population to Australia or New Zealand or even elsewhere, while keeping the claim to Tuvalu as a sovereign state, as an entity. That's a really new domain that's pushing the boundaries of what we've known so far. But as I said in the beginning, recognition and statehood, as much as they are physical and objective features, they're also socially constructed. So I wouldn't rule out that in the future we will have sort of those entities. And certainly, if you look at Facebook, Apple, Google, all of them are often recognized as digital states or proto-states because of their economic power, agency, influence, and activeness, the capacity to shape and act like a state. So certainly those transnational, multinational corporations are increasingly gaining power. They're part of world summits, they're part of decision making. So that's also one domain of that sort of hybrid shared sovereignty or statehood between states and private entities, as well as between analog and digital world, or as Diane alluded, earthly and planetary domains. So cyber and so on and so forth. So it's an exciting time for the field to see how it's expanding in different directions. If you ask me, it's also going downwards in terms of decentralizing We're moving towards city states or city capacity to recognize states. I've worked recently on that topic, so it's really pulling the debate and the topic and concept in all directions. I think that's the most accurate way to describe.
Well, I think it's a sign of a good webinar when we've answered a lot of questions and we've also asked new ones. So I would like to thank both of our expert speakers, Gezim and Diane. We're giving you a virtual applause in cyberspace for your participation today and your wonderful insight and explanation and helping us make sense of this. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, thank you to our distinguished expert panelists, and thank you to our audience for joining Defining Statehood, Law, Legitimacy, and Global Power, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. You will be able to find a video of today's dialogue posted on our YouTube channel. Just search World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Please like and subscribe while you're there. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on upcoming programs, both in-person and virtual ones. Just go to our website to subscribe. It's wacatlanta.org. We look forward to seeing you at a future program, either in person or online. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.